great to see everybody here after 2 years of lockdown and COVID. It's nice to be able to get to see old friends and colleagues again.
Firstly,
we are working our way.
That's another sort of energy sustainable technology that sort of is great but works against us. It also burns the grass in my yard.
So thank you very much for that. And we've been hearing some pretty compelling stuff this morning. I feel a bit of an outlier today. I've never been a fireman, I'm not a fire engineer, and I'm definitely not an academic, but bear with me. I'm a waste and recycling specialist, and we've got some things to share which have the potential to challenge some of the traditional thinking on storage of refuse and recycling, storage of waste. At metroSTOR, our mission, and actually I believe it's a personal mission, is for me is safer homes, better communities, and a cleaner world. We've since 2014 we've upgraded thousands of bin stores on social housing across the UK. About 15,000 at the last count, and rising rapidly. For us, it's about reducing the fire risk arising from waste, improving those environments and increasing recycling. And they're all linked in a way to fire safety. So just looking at waste materials, and Phil touched on this a moment ago, there are, according to the statistics, I think around 30,000 bin fires or refuse fires on average every year. And that's a lot. These are not isolated incidents. And refuse is often, I can't give you the stats, but there's a significant number of occasions where refuse is either involved at the source of a fire, at the source of ignition, or it aids the spread. And of course, there's the smoke that's generated. Touched on the plastics just now, and those I found that really insightful. The bit about the smoke not always being visible. These are all applicable to refuse. A large proportion of that material is plastics. So the question I want to put is, why do we put this in a building? There's taking that back a step. I guess we know why buildings were designed in this way. I am thinking principally of I call them the legacy buildings, the high-rise council flats, not so much the more recent builds, but the older stock, and there's still a lot of it out there. We know there's some that are being redeveloped and so forth, but there's still hundreds of blocks of this type, as you well know. I was speaking with someone in Bristol City Council earlier in the week. They've got 67 high-rise blocks. That's just one city. So they were designed mostly with convenience in mind. Internal refuse chutes, internal bin rooms, hoppers on every floor, and it was a time when much less waste was produced back 50, 60 years ago. And I think it's fair to say those guys, they couldn't have anticipated how both the composition of the waste and the quantity of the waste was going to increase. We're left with a situation, I believe, where some of those facilities are not really now fit for purpose. We've got that combustible material stored within the building. We've got that beautiful chimney going up through, allowing smoke to spread. Yes, there should be hoppers with the there should be things in place to prevent smoke spreading. We know that. But we also know that they easily get damaged. They easily get bypassed. People actually take the hoppers off to actually force material into the chute. And the you've got that, almost like that, they're very accessible. There's a vulnerability to ignition, I call it. You've got people that've got access to those, that have got sources of ignition. And interesting on that stat just now on the much higher number of fires that are set deliberately in buildings of this type. So, yeah, to me, it just seems crazy that we have this material, combustible material, within the building, which is vulnerable. Is there an alternative? If there is, I think we should be using it. There isn't always, but where there is, I think we should be using it. The traditional approaches are around managing that risk and mitigating the consequences. My question really is, can we not remove that risk altogether? In addition to the fire risk, there's a number of other issues around the use of refuse chutes in high-rise residential buildings, not directly fire-related, but they are contributing factors. So one is the odour, the fact that you regularly get blockages. They're often quite small, so even pizza boxes and things like that will block chutes. There's issues for residents, there's issues for the landlords in terms of maintaining them and keeping them safe, both from clean, well maintained, but also maintaining those safety devices. And lastly, the fact that people don't recycle much at all in a high-rise block with a refuse chute, because the default position is just putting them into everything in the chute. Nobody bothers to, or very few people will actually bother to recycle in that type of environment. Now, the reason that's important is because we can leverage that when we're looking at the case, if you like, for decommissioning a refuse chute in a high-rise building. The first response, as always, is that won't work. Can't do it. There's all sorts of reasons why that won't work. What I'm putting to you is it can work. I don't believe this approach is, this response is justified, although I hear it a lot. The suggestion is that people won't take rubbish downstairs, they'll just leave it on the landings. They've been used to doing that for many, many years. What I found is that investment actually drives behaviour change in a really, really big way. People actually want to recycle, but we're not making it easy enough for them. People are bothered about the odour, the antisocial behaviour and all the things that go with that. We need to leverage that to actually drive change and actually make a safer environment. There's a need to harness that inertia within the residents' groups and things that they want to actually achieve. And without question, there's a need to very, very carefully plan and manage that process, without question. What I wanted to share with you is a project that I was involved with the London Borough of Hounslow, which was a very, very impressive piece of work on their part, and I feel very privileged to have had a part in it. They explain just to summarise, they explain the rationale really, really clearly to their residents, and they made it an easy process, or as easy as it could be. And we found that they were prepared to actually change the way that they lived and behaved in order to achieve for everyone a safer and more pleasant environment. So just looking at that in a bit more detail, like most of the London boroughs, they have a large social housing stock, in their case about 16,000 homes. Quite a proportion of those are flats, a high proportion. We typically find in the London boroughs that they can have 60-70% of their stock is actually flats. And as part of their development of their fire safety strategy following Grenfell, they were looking very closely at refuse chutes. They had a lot of discussions with residents. They found that the residents actually shared those concerns. There was a strong element going on there that they could build on. It was in the years directly following the Grenfell tragedy. The residents were all already worried about this, and there were other things that they were worried about too. So they were looking at decommissioning refuse chutes as one of their prime objectives. They also removed storage sheds where residents could store anything on different floors. There could be paint, there could be all sorts of things in there. They didn't know what was in there, so they were removing those as well. The residents were concerned about antisocial behaviour on every landing. There's a chute room, and those chute rooms were being used for all sorts of activities. Rubbish was being left in those rooms, on the landings. All sorts of things were going on. There was a big problem. They needed to find a viable alternative, and they first trialled the use of external waste and recycling hubs separate from the building as the alternative. They did that first on low-rise blocks, which made complete sense. So getting the waste and recycling in accessible locations outside each block, and that worked very well. And they started to move on to larger projects. In March last year, they decommissioned chutes on 6 high-rise blocks, 22 floors each. So what actually happened in reality, in practice, they had a Hearts and Minds campaign. There was a lot of fairly informal activity, it has to be said, between the caretaking concierge staff, housing managers, explaining again what was needed, why they were doing it, and those concerns around rubbish that's being left on landings, etc., didn't materialise. There was a couple of weeks, and where they had to have a few conversations, but it settled down exceptionally quickly, and the antisocial behaviour, drug usage, rough sleeping, inappropriate disposal, bulk items, all that sort of thing. Service charges, a lot of costs were being service charged to the client, to the residents, so that was also a problem for them. That didn't, the outcome was very good. Only I reviewed that again with a client a few months ago, and the positives have only strengthened. The residents have really embraced change in order to get a secure, a cleaner and safer environment. One thing I should have mentioned is that the council offered residents the option of assisted collection, and only the residents of 5 flats out of about 500, 600 actually took that up, which I found interesting. They'd say, "Oh, I've got a neighbour that can help me. My daughter does it," and that sort of thing. So whilst they offered it, there were actually not very many people that actually required that.
Tall Building Fire Safety Network delivers high-quality safety management training for anyone involved in the fire risk management of high-rise or tall buildings. Recognised by the Institution of Fire Engineers, we've been delivering fire safety training since 2011, and many organisations rely on our training for gaining competence in this field. Sign up for our training courses and conferences in 2023. The recycling actually went up by about 4 times. So the volume of recycling, which can obviously now be dealt with in the appropriate manner, that's a huge benefit to the council. They even, as you can see, they involved the local school children. So that was a great initiative. They designed posters, they printed them, put them on the bin housings, and they really brought the community together in a way that they'd never seen before. So there's lots of reasons why why they did this, and the benefits that they got there. The fire risk from refuse has been eliminated. The antisocial behaviour has also gone. There's no smell of rubbish in the buildings. And even outside, there's less litter, and there's this massive increase in recycling. So, so a question really is, So should we be continuing to store combustible material in high-risk residential buildings? I suggest that wherever possible, we shouldn't. What I would say, though, is that doesn't automatically mean by putting the rubbish and the recycling outside the building, we've removed the fire risk. Of course, we haven't. We know that. We know that bins outside blocks are at risk. They are a fire risk, and there's guidance surrounding that. So I just wanted to cover off that in a bit more detail, because clearly there's going to be a concern around seeing a row of bins unsecured, actually attracting fly tipping, and we could have a big fire risk there if we don't get this right. So it is really important that we do get this right. I've developed this process, this 10 golden rules for bin storage, which I believe picks up the different elements that are necessary to make sure we get the right outcome. Now, forgive me, it won't all seem directly related to fire safety, but it is, because it's about good housekeeping, and it's preventing those like the bulky waste and that sort of thing building up, which obviously leads to, as a trigger, can act as a trigger to arson and the events that we're obviously seeking to avoid. So, running through these in an individual detail, the first thing is to make sure we've got the sufficient capacity there to actually contain the refuse and recycling that's being produced. We so often see overflowing bins and all the problems that go with that. The British Standard is interesting. It gives us a guide on this of 70 litres per bedroom, 30 litres per flat. So you can work out what your total weekly capacity should be. If collections are only every other week, then clearly you'll need to double it. And then you have to actually separate it out into different waste and recycling streams as required by the local council. But this is gives a good guide to make sure we've got enough capacity there. The second is accessibility. Now, really important that we get this facility where residents can get to it easily, preferably a point where they pass, on a daily basis. We don't want them going out of their way; it just doesn't work. There's also requirements for the refuse collectors, and if we can meet their requirements, i.e. get it within 10 metres of the curb for a large bin, 25 metres for the smaller wheelie bins, then they'll collect from our store and they'll put it back. So we're not relying on either residents or somebody else to actually put bins back, where they came from and keep the area clean and tidy, which I think is a really important point there. In terms of the fire safety aspect, in terms of locating bins outside buildings, my feeling is that there's a bit of a vacuum here in terms of actual guidance. Using an individual risk-based approach is right. We do need to take into account the individual site conditions, but I do think some stronger guidance would be helpful, because there's so many situations where risk assessors are just going, yeah, it's okay, but they're not really thinking through what's the worst thing that could happen. The government advice on sleeping accommodation fire risk assessments says that bins should be secured, safe distance from the building. Don't tell us what that safe distance is, but that's some help. The CFPA did some research over 10 years ago now on calculating the fire load of bins, and their sort of headline thing is that the bins should be 6 metres away from the dwelling. I think it's we could do a lot better than that. It doesn't really take into account the variations in fire load from the contents, the size of the bin or the number of bins, and they're all very, very relevant to this. They do give a calculation, a formula, which is width of object plus 2.5 metres. So you can take the row of bins, add 2.5 metres, and that gives you your safety distance. When you need to measure that from any point where fire could enter the building, so door opening, window opening, etc., soffits, extractor fans, that's really how we're measuring and making sure that we've got a safe distance. If you can't achieve that, Then you need to put something else in place. The CFPA guidance does allow for the provision of a non-combustible enclosure. So separating it with a structure of 30 minutes fire resistance. So that's how we cover off the fire safety aspect of bins outside dwellings. And important, of course, that they're secured so that they can't be pushed up against the building. Visibility, I think, is important. If you put this facility where it can be seen by residents, then you'll get a much lower incidence of antisocial behaviour, misuse. But conversely, you don't want it to be too visible from the road, because then that obviously attracts fly tipping as well. Ease of use, can't stress this enough. Can be really difficult for some residents, especially elderly, wheelchair users, young children, to actually use those large bins with a big lid, lifting a lid, putting the rubbish in with the other can be a real challenge. So one of the things we do is we make that as easy a process as possible. It's all about the resident journey, the customer journey, free flow, removing obstacles, and putting bins inside a housing with the lid open can actually really help that process and keep everything clean and tidy. Communication, really important. What should be going in each bin, who should be using the facility, where they can take bulky items, electrical goods, so forth, and what will happen to them if they don't. Segregation is really important. Getting the right stuff in the right bin and actually making it physically impossible to put large rubbish bags in the recycling. Because if it's contaminated, it won't get emptied, you'll get overflowing, you'll get side waste, you'll get those arson triggers that we mentioned just now. Bulk waste, sofas, furniture, etc. is clearly an issue, and not one I don't think that's really picked up enough by councils and landlords. They're expecting residents to pay to have items removed. A lot of these guys just are not in a position to do that, and I think we need to have a much more comprehensive approach to actually removing bulk material. Securing to prevent unauthorised use. So if you've got houses and flats very close, you've got flats and shops very close, often you'll need to define and delineate who should actually be or who is able to use those bins. And there's obviously various ways of doing that. Make it look good, make it a place that people actually want to use, they meet their neighbours and so forth. Sounds crazy, but it is actually really important. That social interaction is really important. Keep it clean, keep it tidy, and it will stay that way. And lastly, be prepared to use enforcement because there need to be consequences. And having that mechanism in place which allows, puts a framework in place to identify, fine, etc., non-conformance, is a great help in actually keeping areas clean and tidy. So, what I really want to say is, oh no, at the risk of repeating myself, I believe there is a viable alternative to traditional refuse chutes and internal storage systems. But follow the steps though, and that'll ensure that you succeed every time. Thank you very much.